So we will register, we will educate, and then when it comes down to it, we will vote. They might preach NRA, they might preach GUN, but we're preaching REV. Register, educate, vote. Thank you, and hello, Uncle Myron.
You are listening to TMI for the week of March 26th, 2018.
On the show today, we have American activist Harvey Wasserman, who has for 30 years been involved with energy, the environment, politics, and history. Representing Greenpeace USA, Wasserman has addressed 350,000 concertgoers at Woodstock in 1994. In 1973, he helped pioneer the grassroots movement against atomic reactors, helped coin the phrase "no nukes" in 1974. He was media spokesman for the Clamshell Alliance that organized mass demonstrations at Seabrook, New Hampshire, against reactors being built there. He writes regularly for a wide internet readership: EcoWatch, Solartopia.org, freepress.org, and www.nukefree.org, which he edits. His articles also appear at Commondreams, CounterPunch, HuffingtonPost, Buzzflash, and others. He hosts the Green Power and Wellness Show Tuesdays at 5 p.m. Eastern on the Progressive Radio Network. Find it on the web, prn.fm.
Wind and solar is installing as we speak.
Right, exactly.
And is wind a big issue in California?
Well, it's moving along. It's not debated very heavily, but it's there. It's coming.
Yeah.
We just need the ammo to shut.
The arguments against it are so, weak, like they're ugly, or if you cite them too close to residential, obviously. But I assume there's some mountain areas that would get pretty good wind. You could mount large-scale solar in sort of remote, high-altitude areas in California.
Yeah, that's happening. The solar in the desert and wind in the mountain.
I read your bio on Solartopia. It's solartopia.org/bio, and it's quite a read. It's a stunning list of ways you've been involved for a long time in environmentalism. So, a question I'm always curious about is, how did you get into activism? It's an outwardly projected focus. It's not for introverts, I assume. When did you start to realize this was going to be a path for you?
Well, when I was 16, there was a roller rink in Columbus, and I was motivated to go down and picket against it, and that's what we did, and we won, amazingly enough.
And one little success fuels you to move to another.
Yeah.
It
was, it was fun, actually. My parents were liberals, and so it just came kind of naturally to me.
Well, that's what I was going to ask next was, were you a pain-in-the-ass kid sent to the principal's office frequently? But
no,
you were raised by liberals, and so...
Yeah, but I was very well behaved. I was a good student, and it wasn't part of my DNA to be a troublemaker in school, because I liked school.
Yeah.
And so, no, quite the opposite, actually. But I did have, my parents were very generous and warm and kind people, and they were both born within a year and a mile of John Kennedy. And it just kind of came naturally to me to go ahead and be a social activist.
And
pretty much in my DNA.
Yeah. So you studied history, amongst other things. This is
well,
a useful
back
tool.
When I was early young, I read biographies of the founders. I don't know how much I got out of them, but for some reason, I was doing it. And my father loved history and would always read history books before he went to sleep. So it was just something that he left to me, and it was a great gift.
Yeah. Actually, history is very instrumental in making your arguments and sewing them into a track record.
It's always a good story.
Yeah.
History. People always love a good story, and that's the secret to writing history books and to studying history is to like a good story and tell a good story.
Right.
So, but when I went to, I first went to the University of Michigan, in 1963, I was signing up for my courses, and I had a very domineering counselor, advisor. And I tried to sign up. I was in a special part of the U of M, and I had 3 required courses, great books, language. I had to take French, which was a mistake. And one other course I remember, and I had an elective, and I told him I wanted to take political science, and he wrote down history for some reason. And I couldn't really argue with this guy. He was really domineering. So that's how I wound up with history. And then when it came to decide what kind of history to study, I realized that there was less American history than other countries, and that I would, if I stayed with American, I wouldn't have to learn a language. So that's how I became an American history major.
Wow.
But it was great. University of Michigan was a great place, and I was there from 63 to 67, and to be in Ann Arbor in those years was just, the greatest. If you had to choose when and where to go to school, to university, that would be about the best choice you can make.
Because of the setting, or was it the sort of era of social change?
Both. Ann Arbor was a gorgeous place, still is actually, and self-contained and sort of a bubble, and the times were just spectacular. From 63 to 67, the whole world changed. I went there before the Beatles and left amidst, the war in Vietnam. It was just a spectacular time to be alive and be in college.
You got involved in some famous marches towards the end of the 60s.
Well, we started in 65. They had the first teach-in in Vietnam, against Vietnam, and what happened was there were a bunch of professors that were going to go on strike to protest the war in Vietnam, and the administration of the university made it pretty clear that they would not be happy about this. And so professors put their heads together and decided instead of striking, they would teach more. And so they called for a teach-in about Vietnam at midnight. The university gave them the classrooms, and they started doing it, and in March of 65. And then in 2015, some students and professors got together and decided to have another teach-in on the 50th anniversary on global warming.
Interesting.
And so I actually got to speak in the same room.
Wow.
50 years later on global warming. I was the only one to speak who had been a student during the teach-ins 50 years earlier. It was an amazing feeling.
Wow.
In the same room. They didn't do it at midnight. They were, of course, now they were welcome to do it. It was on a weekend during the day, and I got to speak with Tom Hayden and Amy Goodman, and other great people.
Wow.
And it was really an amazing feeling. But so too in '65, and by then I was an editor at the Daily, the Michigan Daily. That was also an incredible gift. The Daily is a student-run newspaper. It comes out 6 days a week, and it has its own building. And I kind of just stumbled into the Daily in my sophomore year, and that really changed my life. It was just a wonderful, incredible experience. And I became an editorial director my senior year, and became a journalist because of it. Actually, I found I loved to write, and the people on the paper were just fabulous.
And then by the mid-'70s, you seem to be... Were you focused on nuclear?
Well, what happened was, although ironically, I had done a report on atomic energy in ninth grade when I was bar mitzvahed here in Columbus. We're Jewish. I got a gift from the neighbors of a book called Our Friend the Atom by Walt Disney, and it was basically a pro-nuclear picture book.
Mm-hmm.
And it basically got me interested in atomic energy. So when I had to do a science report in ninth grade, I did it on nukes, and of course I thought they were wonderful and they'd save the world.
Mm-hmm.
Just as many people did. In fact, the Port Huron statement, the radical screed for the Students for Democratic Society, also supported nuclear power. But in 1973, for a wide variety of reasons, I was living on a hippie farm, a commune in western Massachusetts. And the local utility company came in and said they were going to build a nuclear plant 4 miles from our house. And we were doing organic gardening, and we just assumed at this point that if the large corporations were for this, it was going to be a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we were right, of course. And so we organized on my farm to stop it. And we came up with the slogan, No Nukes, which has gone all over the world. Very successful slogan. Yeah. And
coined by you in 1974, as I understand.
Well, yeah, I put it in the local paper, but it was basically a group, phenomenon, because we had decided that we didn't want any nuclear power plants at all. And this was a pretty radical stance back then. People were arguing for greater safety, or for maybe not as many, but we became abolitionists, essentially. And we campaigned and actually defeated this nuclear power plant.
Wow. And so 1974, that's around the time that Silkwood dies.
Yes, that was in November.
And how aware of that whole story were you at the time?
Very, actually. We knew people who knew her.
Ah.
And it was a big part of the anti-nuclear culture at the time. So this was a big deal, and very close friends of mine were involved in writing the screenplay about that Meryl Streep starred in.
Yeah,
and I'm still friendly with Danny Sheehan and Sarah Nelson, who were key at the Christic Institute to that whole situation. So
now that movie doesn't come out till 1983 or 4, but in the meantime, we've got a very weird year, 1979. And I actually remember as a kid, because there was a protest here in Ontario. There was a Greenpeace protest protesting the Darlington nuclear power station, and I had been to that demonstration. So I think I was already pretty much as a kid thinking about nuclear. And then I remember the night of the TMI accident and sort of rain falling and looking at the radar that was on cable TV at the time. And, thinking, where's this air
and cloud going?
Well, I came up there actually. The wind at the time in 3 Mile Island actually was a lot of it blew north, and a lot of it did blow into Ontario. So that is a reality, and you had a right to be worried. And unfortunately, Darlington, Bruce, and Pickering all got built, and now we're hoping at some point soon they'll shut down. Although, as you well know, it's a pretty big battle.
Well, they're rebuilding Darlington because they don't last as long as they promised they would. And there's Pickering next door, which has already lived past its promised lifespan. They have to keep that open because they have to shut down Darlington to rebuild it. And then there's always this ongoing refurbs at the 8 reactors at Bruce. So it just goes on and on and on. There's a lock-in effect.
It's a terrible scam. I mean, these guys find ways to, it's like fixing roads. They're just endless, and if they can keep doing it, they'll scam the public and make good money or bad money. Well, there's a lot of it to be made.
In the circle of political pundits, we never really ask or talk about nuclear, and we all cannot figure out why Ontario has the most expensive electricity in the country, and yet 99% of all our running nuclear reactors exist only in Ontario, but we cannot figure out why we've got this expensive electricity.
Well, they need to be shut as soon as possible. I had a friend who was working in Toronto on wind power for quite a while, and of course the wind is very, very powerful up there, and it really needs to be used. And the more wind you can build, the better, and especially large numbers of windmills should go into the lake now, because the winds in the Great Lakes are actually among the strongest in the world.
Absolutely.
And they actually need to be used to the best of our ability.
Yeah, well, the sort of debate right now is why refurb Darlington when we can buy cheap hydro from Quebec, who has a long time surplus of hydro. Just sitting right there, but interprovincial.
Well, it's a scam. It's a scam. I mean, the people who run and operate these plants make a ton of money on them. It doesn't have anything to do with supplying the public with power. It's just a way for them to make big money at public expense.
Yeah. New builds in the United States aren't going very well.
No, we're done except for these 2 reactors at Vogtle in Georgia. The 2 in South Carolina went down, thankfully, DC summer. But in Georgia, they're hanging on no matter what it costs. So bankrupt that state, basically. And it's, of course, ridiculous. I still doubt that they'll ever be finished. But, with Trump in the White House, they're bound and determined to milk the taxpayer and ratepayer for every cent they can get. And so those projects have proceeded.
It was really kind of a roll of the dice how pro-nuclear Trump would be, at least in my mind, because, and this is before he was elected, I thought that he wouldn't be into states subsidizing industry. But, of course, there's just no predicting his policies on anything, really.
Right. Well, he seems bound and determined to do every possible evil thing he can do. And, that seems to be his moral compass, is to make it as bad as possible for everybody. Yeah. And wherever there's a set to be scammed, he's there to do it. So the nuclear thing is just another travesty to which he seems to be devoted, and that's what we're going to be dealing with. But the economics of nuclear, in terms of the market, are so bad that it's going to be tough for them to hang on. But I do not believe that there will be another serious attempt to build any reactors in this country, because even though they messed with the market, the price of solar and wind has dropped so amazingly well that you can't even begin to make a case. you can put up a wind farm in a year or less, which generate electricity, at a fraction the cost of nuclear now. And solar is just, booming ahead. He's tried to harm solar with these tariffs, but even that isn't going to make a dent in the long term. The economics are just too powerful. And that's one of the reasons I've remained somewhat of an optimist, is that the technologies that we need to survive have dropped in price so radically that it, seems to be working in our favor. It's definitely working in our favor.
And conservation went a long way to change the nature of demand as well.
Yeah, and increased efficiency. Well, LED lighting has helped, and many other developments. So this is something that we can be optimistic about and hopeful about. So that's what my book, Solartopia, basically says. It's a look at a world, and this was done in the mid-2000s, 2005, 6, 7, that you can look down and see the vision of a totally green-powered Earth, and it's completely possible with current technology.
In terms of science fiction, so, for a futuristic society, and you had the choice between free energy that you just capture, whether it's wind or solar or flowing water or whatever, versus an energy you have to, acquire, process, and then there's wastes, etc. It just seems like a futuristic society would choose the free energy source that's just sitting right there.
Yeah, we just have to get rid of this horrendous legacy of a technology, nuclear, which never really worked very well, and which is fraught with tremendous danger. I mean, we're in the midst now of the 7th year since Fukushima started, and of course it's ongoing and hasn't stopped killing people. Fukushima, quite the opposite. Today's the sad anniversary, and yesterday I was on a panel that saw a movie called, discussed a movie called Nuclear Cattle,
Okay.
Cattle.
Yeah.
They're actually farmers near downwind from Fukushima that are refusing to slaughter their cows. They were cattle farmers, and the government ordered them all the cattle to be disposed of, and there's one farmer in particular who has refused to do it and has become a ferocious activist. And it's one of the most moving films I've ever seen, Nuclear Cattle. And the devastation that's been caused by this accident is just heartbreaking and extremely dangerous. And there are hot spots all over Japan now, and this idea of having the Olympics in Japan is insane. There are hot spots in Tokyo from which people should really be evacuated because of this fallout from Fukushima, which is continuing unabated.
Right.
There's been no let-up in the radioactive emissions at Fukushima. They're still pouring into the ocean.
I have a question that, maybe I haven't been looking as deep into this as I should have been recently, but here's my question. It's like, are those basements of those reactor buildings still full of water? Because that was the whole idea, is that the water that they were running over the reactors was flowing into the basements and then leaching out into the local groundwater, and then, as we all know, it flows out to sea through the groundwater. But I'll bet you those basements are still flooded.
Oh, everything's flooded.
Yeah.
Everything's still flooded. It's a complete nightmare.
Yeah.
And it's still happening, and the radiation is still pouring into the biosphere, and it's people are dying, and the cleanup, and
there was that ice wall. Remember the
the
ice wall idea?
completely failed.
Yeah.
It completely failed.
Freezing
So,
the ground.
It's truly horrendous.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like a cheap thing to do to try to freeze the ground in terms of energy efficiency.
Well, it's amazing how stupid these guys really are when you get right down to it.
Yeah.
I mean, they just don't stop, and they have no solutions, and they come up with insanities that will make them money, and nothing else matters.
Find us on Twitter @ThatArcher, our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Rate the show on iTunes. It changes the way the show is listed.
A question for you, maybe historically, this is either in or outside of your wheelhouse, but I'm trying to figure out the connections between the White House scandal and what we're seeing now with Trump evolve in slow motion.
Which White House scandal?
The Watergate scandal, sorry.
Oh, you mean way back when?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the elements are we got special prosecutors. We've got a web that seems to get bigger and bigger the deeper we look. People covering up, trying to fire investigators. Every single member of the White House seems to be complicit in some way. It's a constitutional crisis.
Then or now or both?
What parallels can we draw?
You have to remember that both Richard Nixon and Donald Trump are have been creatures of organized crime.
Okay.
Trump's father was being a builder in New York City. You don't be a builder in New York City without doing business with the mob.
Yeah.
And there's been very clear documentation that Trump's father was doing business with 2 of the 5 families in the New York City Mafia. And Nixon was also tied to the mob. And Nixon had this guy in South Florida named B.B. Rebozo, his buddy, and he was also a mob guy. And Nixon was tied to Meyer Lansky. And I think if Mueller does his job, we will see that the connection of Putin with Trump is a mob connection. I mean, Trump is a lousy businessman, and he was continually in debt. And there was only one place he ultimately can turn because he was such a bad guy to do business with, and that was the mob, the Russian mob in this case. And so, the beef that we have with the Russians is not necessarily with the Russian people or the Russian government. It's with Putin's mafia. And so that's the similarity, the big overlap between Trump and Nixon. And that's why the stuff that keeps coming out is so endless, and that's where it's going to go if Mueller does his job. That's why Trump doesn't want anybody to see his tax returns.
Another thing that I'll never understand is the last 100 years, trillions of dollars were spent fighting communists one way or another, from the tip of South America to just about anywhere that you can argue the Americans have involved themselves in politics. It's always been, all the ICBMs and all of their interference has always been in a fight against communism. How, overnight, can the Republican base or Trump supporters be willing to ignore ties with what was our arch enemy for the last 100 years? That I'll never get over that.
It's always been a scam. The Cold War was always a scam.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just basically an advertising tool for the weapons industry. It was never about communism or, for some it was, I suppose.
Well, the McCarthy hearings, for example, it seemed to embody the ideology of the United States being, an arch enemy of communism.
Yeah, well, the ideology was always Joe McCarthy's career. Right. I mean, it didn't have anything to do with anything real. He didn't understand. He didn't care about anything except being famous and, keeping a sanity. He was also a drug addict, by the way.
Huh.
And his tie to J. Edgar Hoover and that whole crowd was, the whole drug war was a scam, and McCarthy really couldn't have cared less about communism. It was a game, and it made him famous, and that's what he wanted. It got him public attention and allowed him to, fund the FBI, and that's what it was about. Same with Trump. Well, here's the current incarnation is Jeff Sessions is marijuana prohibition.
Right.
I mean, he couldn't care less about the public health. It has nothing to do with protecting people from the so-called dangers of pot, which is ultimately a benign herb. What he really is about is keeping the beds in the prisons full and keeping his guys employed. And, the pharmaceutical industry is terrified of cannabis for good reasons in their world.
Yeah.
So,
And it's not about democracy either, because California and other states, using the tools of democracy, have made their own rules about it, and Session on the federal level wants to interfere with that. So it's not about democracy.
Actually, it is about democracy, but the opposite. Sorry. It's about suppressing democracy.
Right.
Because the drug war was originally designed by Nixon to keep black people and young people from voting. That's what the drug war primarily was about. In the early 70s, Nixon, hated blacks, he hated hippies, and his Southern strategy required the prevention of black people from voting. And because you can, on the one hand, in the United States, the South has basically been a Democratic Party stronghold since the time of Andrew Jackson in 1828. And then in the 30s, black people flipped from the Republican Party of Lincoln to the Democrats of FDR, and then, of course, Kennedy and Johnson. And so Nixon was able to get the white Democrats in the South to jump to the Republicans by being a racist, but still wasn't enough. They had to keep the black people from voting. And so the drug war was brought in because there are laws against felons voting in the United States and other stuff. And so between 1970 and today, more than 40 million people have been arrested for drugs, vast majority of them being black and Hispanic. And that's what the drug war has really been about. That's how the Republican Party has retained power in this country, is by suppressing democracy with the use of the drug war.
Interesting.
Yeah, well, there's a great book that I highly recommend to you and your listeners, by a law professor from Ohio State named Michelle Alexander. It's called The New Jim Crow. And she basically put out the reality that, that's what the drug war has been, the Jim Crow from the 70s on, aimed at disenfranchising black people.
In a recent show, I interviewed a doctor who represents the medical marijuana industry in Canada. And, so we're going through, I guess, what California went through. In July, it's supposed to become not a criminal offense federally. And provinces are undertaking plans to distribute it in a legal way. So, it's
a big deal. It's a big deal economically. I mean, I'm in California, and it's legal here now, and you don't see people standing around getting stoned on the streets. I mean, it's a huge economic windfall for the state, as it was in Colorado, and the basic impacts are a decline in arrests, a decline in the prison population, a boom in tax revenues, and no noticeable impact on automobile, fatalities or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
People in the big problem is that people on pot, and you should not drink, drive while stoned. I mean, that's stupid. But the people who drive stoned tend to go too slow.
Mm-hmm.
The big joke is that when you legalize pot, you need to raise the minimum speed limit. But it's been a almost total success. There's also a drop in opioid deaths,
Right.
where cannabis is legal, because no one dies from pot. You can die maybe from overeating and when you smoke too much, and I don't recommend smoking anything, frankly. But cannabis in edibles and other methods. I have a friend who has lung cancer, or had lung cancer, and he was treated with sort of a boutique chemo. In other words, they really pinpointed the specific kind of cancer, and then rather than giving him full body chemo, they gave him a very specific chemo. But they also had him take cannabis suppositories, partly to maintain his weight, his appetite.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a very strong, I think, credible school of research and thought that says that cannabis fights cancer, and so this is a big deal. If it proves out to be true, which I wouldn't be surprised, that it's going to have an impact. In fact, I worked for Greenpeace for many years. I'm still affiliated with Greenpeace, and one of my coworkers was named Peter Grinspoon, and his father was a professor in the Harvard Medical School at the same time as Tim Leary and Richard Alpert, and there were, advocating pot. And so Professor Lester Grinspoon got angry about it, and he took a sabbatical to write a book about the dangers of marijuana, to warn students not to smoke it. And about halfway into his research, he concluded that marijuana was in fact a miracle drug. And he wrote a book called Marijuana Reconsidered, and went around testifying for the medical benefits of marijuana, and still advocates it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think again, a reason to be optimistic is that I think the legalization of pot is a pretty big deal, because it does help people, and it eliminates one of the excuses, the pretexts by which young people and people of color have been repressed and disenfranchised.
There's not a lot of examples of actual meaningful social change. Okay, the government getting out of our bedrooms a little bit, maybe some gay rights changes, but I mean, there, on one hand, I mean, there's not a lot of real change that we've seen. Maybe you could argue this the other way, but this seems to represent a profoundly huge social change. I mean, when you've probably jailed 60 million people, I'm just pulling that number out of the air, over the course of Prohibition, and then we actually see the government roll back one of its sort of authorities over us, it really is a rare thing, isn't it?
Well, that's one of the reasons I remain an optimist. I mean, you've got two dimensions. Well, there are many, of course, but you get two particular dimensions of social reality and confrontation, and one is economics and the environment tied together. And we haven't done very well with that. The power of the corporations is bigger than ever, and Trump is really a product of the power of corporations, as was Hillary. That's the problem. There was no real choice. And the power of organized money, capital, is just worse than it's ever been. On the other hand, the culture has really been revolutionized. Being as old as I am and remembering the 60s, the early 60s, and growing up in the 1950s in Central Ohio, which was just, it's like growing up in a loaf of white bread.
Mm-hmm.
those two dimensions, we haven't done very well with social justice. We haven't done very well in curbing the power of corporations. We're in the midst of a horrendous environmental crisis, obviously, but the culture has been completely revamped. You know, women's rights, of course, the women still have a long way to go, but the discussion is just totally revolutionized. The acceptance of gay rights. I mean, I have a gay cousin, Howard, who lives in Halifax. He moved up there originally, he and his partner, to get married. You know, I mean, he would have been completely not tolerated at all in the early days. It must have been very difficult for him growing up. I have a female gay cousin on the other side who is a professor, openly gay, raised a son with her partner, and you know, 20, 30 years ago, even, she could never have gotten a job.
Yeah.
So, and, you know, you have gay Maren Zwiegel, you have a gay U.S. Senator, Tammy Baldwin. I actually met the first gay congressman, openly gay, Jerry Stubbs from Cape Cod. Of course, Provincetown is a gay stronghold. And so that's a big deal, to have gay Maren Zwiegel, to have sexual preference openly discussed, the issues of race the way they are now. I mean, the music, the style of dress, the discussions of sexuality, you know, these are all revolutionary changes, and good ones that I think will make our world much more livable if we survive. The question now is getting the corporations and you know, the lunatics like the Ford brothers and Donald Trump somehow under control. That's the big challenge now.
So the Me Too movement, in a way, maybe just to people like myself, came out of nowhere. And I often think of a snowball. There's some magic amount that once it gets to some critical mass size, it can snowball into a big thing quite quickly. The idea of campaign finance reform getting to that snowball effect, and because we're talking about trying to get corporations out of politics, essentially, seems to be the root of almost all our problems, doesn't it?
Yes. The power of money over our political situation is very, very, that's the daunting fact. That's the cancer that's killing us.
Yeah.
You know, the inability of our societies to get on top of money in our elections has just been devastating.
So the NRA is an example.
Sure. I mean, the NRA is just a sales organization for the weapons industry. The idea, and, you know, as an American historian, I can say without hesitation that none of the founders of the United States would have ever interpreted the Second Amendment as a license for individuals to own automatic weapons and semi-automatic weapons. That is absolutely. I guarantee you, if you lined up the people who signed the Constitution and who supported the Second Amendment and showed them these kids running around with automatic weapons, devastating schools, they've been horrified.
Mm-hmm.
The Second Amendment is very clear. You know, if you are a member of a well-regulated militia and you're owning a gun that serves the security of a free state, you can get a gun license. Otherwise, forget it. And we're the only country in the world that has this insanity.
Yeah.
So, you know, people in Canada, obviously, they have guns, but they don't go around, they don't have automatic weapons. They don't go around shooting up schools.
Well, actually, that's not entirely.
Ridiculous.
That's really not true. We've had a couple instances where a guy with an automatic weapon has gone into a place of learning, although I think it was a women's engineering wing of a university in Quebec. And he shot up a whole bunch. And there's been another guy who went into a legislature, I think in Quebec, and shot up a bunch there. And another paramilitary guy has gone to Parliament Hill and fired off rounds in the House of Parliament. So, and furthermore, we have a conservative side here that fought what we called a long gun registry. And I have a friend who has a license to, possess firearms. And, this is, people like that, any given day, they could have their shotgun or whatever, a long gun, in their vehicle. And they're just driving around. So, maybe it's harder to get an automatic weapon up here, but you know what? And as much as it's fun to have Americans on and talk about Trump and hear, Canadians are nice, well-educated, polite people. The fact of the matter is that there's no difference between Canada and the United States. When it comes to
you're right. We do have this vision of Canada being this pristine, polite place, but you don't have quite the same access to
automatic
weapon.
That's true.
It is somewhat different. And even Norway had this guy who went in and killed 90 people, for God's sakes. Yeah. So nowhere is perfect, but it's very difficult here. I have kids. I can't imagine the stress that has been, imposed now on the kids in this country who have to go to school and wonder if a shooter is going to turn up. I remember in the 60s, I think it was 65 or it was in the mid-60s when the first mass shooter, was turned up on the Texas Tower. Mm-hmm. Charles Whitman was his name. And, unfortunately, we didn't realize it was the dawn of an era.
Right. Now, that was a semi-automatic. Is that correct? Like he had to reload.
I don't remember, actually.
Yeah.
I don't remember. He killed more than 10 people.
But so I'm saying you could have a really powerful sniper weapon that would maybe even be legal. But if you have to cock it every time you fire, it gives the crowd a chance to dissipate and hide, or law enforcement to move in. It's a different animal than
the Second Amendment gives everybody the right to all the people in the militia who can prove a value for it. It gives them the right to own a single-shot musket. So you want to get a single-shot musket, be my guest. But beyond that, as I say, the founders did not envision automatic weapons, and there is no basis in the Second Amendment. And I don't know if you have a parallel part of your Constitution, but there's no basis in the Second Amendment for a right to own a semi-automatic or an automatic weapon.
Right.
It's just not there.
Let me ask you this. I think that Waco, Texas is part of the mythology of the NRA's success in its argument. The idea of a religious compound, defending itself against a well-armed FBI incursion. I think the images like that are the fuel for this NRA argument, this fear of that, the government's going to come in with automatic weapons, and unless you are ready to fight them off. Isn't that part of the mythology?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
It is. But Waco was an ugly situation. I don't agree with what the government did there. I thought it was pretty. They used the excuse of protecting children, and then they caused all this death. It was not well handled.
Yeah.
Should not have happened. And there's all sorts of stuff, but they'll use pretty much anything. It's all about money. It's all about gun sales, frankly. It doesn't have much to do with reality with protecting the public. Quite the opposite, or basic rights. So the gun situation is just another thing that's out of hand. Trump's degradation of the Environmental Protection Agency, his willingness to let people starve. He's a cool person.
The first thing he did was roll in and kill Meals on Wheels, right? That's mean.
He's just a cruel person. You can have ideological differences. You can have, but he has no ideology.
Yeah.
It's not about ideology. There's nothing that he's doing here for the free market. There's no consistency except for personal enrichment. And we really have, since Andrew Jackson was pretty much the same way, we haven't had a president in there whose sole goal is to make money at the public expense. And Trump is just so tone deaf and so cruel that's really the distinguishing factor. There's nothing that he's doing that rises to the level of an ideology. It's all basically a mafia shakedown.
Nice.
And that's what we're dealing with here. So
the Trumpakov crime family.
Well, he is. He's owned by Putin. I mean, that's one thing people don't. Nobody is really getting to the root of this. Mm-hmm. You know, they're all talking about the Russian government and this and that. It's not about the Russian government. It's about the Russian mob. And Putin is the head. And Putin's a very smart guy, by the way. I mean, I've read a series of interviews done with him by Oliver Stone, and he's well educated. He's intelligent. He just, to my mind, has a terrible sense of self-aggrandizement. And of course, the Russians did suffer a serious trauma when the Soviet Union fell. The Americans put this idiot Yeltsin in there and bragged about it. And I'm sure that many Russians are still angry about Boris Yeltsin. He was a complete embarrassment. And so Putin comes in. He's very well organized. He's well spoken. He's a brilliant politician, and he's a complete mafia don. I mean, the joke here is that if Putin is Don Corleone, Trump is Frito, his idiot son. I don't know. You know, here in the United States, the Godfather movies are kind of required viewing. So, but that's what it's about. I don't think you have quite the same equivalent in Canada, but I could be wrong. No, but there's nothing ideological about Trump. And the thing is that he's just cruel. He's completely void of empathy and compassion, as well as common sense. It's not just that he's the president, which I don't, he wasn't elected. It's that he exists at all. I mean, I've never encountered a human being that completely bereft of any moral compass. I mean, as an example of our species, he's terrifying. So there you go.
On Friday, I think it was, he popped his head in the White House press room to announce, or maybe it was Thursday, a new deal with North Korea. And then hours later, of course, it's being backpedaled. And this is a ongoing pattern in almost everything he's announced. He's had to backpedal it hours later, even after the shootings, new gun control. So, I mean, this not being able to take seriously the leader ever, this is a destabilizing effect.
Well, he's a complete lunatic.
Yeah.
I mean, he has no. Not only doesn't he have a moral compass, there's no self-control.
Right.
It's a mind-boggling situation. No one could have imagined how crazy this guy really is. And he doesn't care. I don't think it's not just he doesn't care. I don't think he has the intellectual capacity to understand what he's doing, which is terrifying in this modern world. Now, and there's no other president you can say that about, except Reagan. Reagan at the end had Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
And Reagan really didn't know what he was doing. But I got to say, and I've just written a new history of the United States. It's called America at the Brink of Rebirth. Reagan had Nancy.
Right.
Nancy Reagan was actually a great stabilizing influence, thank God.
Yeah.
And she's the one who ended the Cold War.
Yeah.
And so Ronnie was completely out of it at the end of his presidency. And he was just as nuts as Trump.
Yeah.
And just as crazy as Trump. But Mrs. Reagan was there to stabilize the country. And Nancy Reagan actually saved the world in a lot of ways. Because, which I don't think Melania is going to do. Nancy Reagan was, she was conservative politically, but she was actually pro-choice. And she, of course, a big difference at the time was also that you had Gorbachev instead of Putin. Gorbachev was actually quite a great man, and would have been, I think, in our country, a New Deal Democrat had he been here. But you had in the late 80s the world-saving combination of Nancy Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. Now you have Melania Trump and Vladimir Putin, I don't think it's going to work as well as it did back then. So yes, Trump is much, much crazier than any of us imagined, and it's really dangerous.
So will this cause people, the other 2/3, to take voting seriously next time?
Yes, it will. And it's a big thing that's happening in our world, and one of the reasons things are so the way they are is that it's the rise of women. We are seeing, and I agree with Steve Bannon on this, the end of 10,000 years of history. I do think that male domination is ending, and that's a very, very big deal.
Mm-hmm.
The rise of the women is the rise of the race, and I have 5 daughters. And I happen to believe that women are actually superior to men, and that in the long run, this is why men like Trump are freaking out. They can't handle it, and they, of course, the race issue is also a big deal, as is the culture. I mean, the whole white male Puritan, it's not Christian, it's Puritan ideology and way of life is just coming to an end. Thank God, as it were. But, nonetheless, it's more than these guys can handle. And so you look at Trump, you look at Putin, you look at the Fords, you look at, these right-wingers all over the world, Shinzo Abe in Japan, the guy in China, they can't handle the idea that women are going to run the show. Yeah. But then you look at Angela Merkel. I mean, I don't agree with her on a lot of things, but she's a sane, rational leader. Now, Maggie Thatcher was one story, but, you have the rise of women becoming a stabilizing and a rationalizing influence, and that's a big part of what's going on in the world.
Yeah, well, it seems like it's an annual women's march and correct me, but there was a big one just after Trump got voted in, and then there was a big one in this recent January. And the numbers went from, again, I think it was like 1 million the first time, and was it 2 million women across various cities marched this time? But this time they had the sides of the streets lined with voter registration information. So these women are not kidding around.
No, and what's also happening now, and this is a big deal, is that I helped do this because of where I was living. The machinery of stealing elections has finally been put under scrutiny. I mean, it started in the United States in 1988. George H.W. Bush was running in a primary in New Hampshire, and they used voting machines, and he basically stole the primary. And then in 2000, of course, the election was stolen, and then in 2004 in Florida, and then in 2004 in Ohio. And so part of the movement that's been happening in this country is that people have been scrutinizing the electronic voting machines, which are really just methods of stealing elections. And I think we're getting a handle on that. And then protecting the voter rolls, which are being systematically stripped of people of color. So this is a pretty big deal. I don't know. I'm not sure if you've had a counterpart in China, in Canada, but it's an important part of the dynamic here in the United States.
Yeah, well, even I think in this recent selection of the leader of the Conservative Party, there is now a debate, it's just literally hours ago, about how the votes were tabulated and when the delegates got access to vote, and some of it is online or on, And we also have the same trick of governments will come in and redistrict, which tends to also help them.
Well,
we had another thing where
gerrymandering.
Yeah. We had another thing for a long time in Canada where, even if your party didn't win, you got some money based on the number of votes that were cast towards you. And we got rid of that. So, we're not going in the right directions in terms of campaign finance reform either.
Right. Well, that's, it's winnable, ultimately. You just have to keep at it. I guess that stems from my optimism as a young guy, which we talked about at the top of the hour, where I went to a demonstration and we desegregated a roller rink and we won.
Yeah.
And the point is that we do win these things. There are revolutions, and the human species does have a survival mechanism. And so we are shutting the reactor industry, and we're winning a lot of stuff, and because our survival depends on it. And so I see Trump as an extreme expression of the accelerating demise of the white male corporate Puritan lunacy.
Yeah.
And I think the primary motivating force in the world is women, and the demand of the mothers of our children to have an earth to live on.
Yeah.
A Mother Earth. And I also see, a return of the indigenous ethic of being in harmony with nature
Mm-hmm.
and with each other. The indigenous societies, with some exceptions, were accepting of homosexuality, and women were matriarchies, and I think that's where we're headed, frankly.
A little question about being an activist. I guess, you've told stories of success, but, sometimes activists feel like they're, beating the drum to a deaf audience, if you will. I've wondered, and I've heard this described, that, people who stay involved in issues and fight these fights, sometimes like, a David versus Goliath, a hopeless battle, there's a swing between optimism and pessimism. Have you found you've had to wrestle with that?
Yeah, well, it's totally dependent on an individual's makeup. I mean, I think most of that has to do with how you were born and how you're raised.
Mm.
I mean, I had very optimistic, loving parents, and maybe even genetically, I'm an optimist. You can't be an activist without being an optimist.
You also have to be good at losing sometimes, individual battles.
Nah, I'm a bad loser.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I don't like to lose.
Another thing I wanted to ask about was that the environmentalist movement in the mid-70s and 80s seemed to tie themselves with a bunch of artists who helped promote the message. You've done this by speaking at concerts and by joining forces with various bands that were quite popular as a way to maybe get more media coverage and
No, it's music. It's about music. Music is a very powerful force. Yeah. And we don't quite understand the impact of music, but, every day in every major city of the world, you can turn on the radio and listen to Beethoven. From 100 and almost 200 years ago. And more than 200, actually. He was born in 1770. And so, music is the power. Of course, celebrity has things to do with it, and it's always great to have celebrity allies, and artists tend to be liberal because they're open-minded and creative, but music itself is a very, very powerful force.
I think Helen Caldecott was saying that towards the end of the 70s there was some alliances between environmentalists and famous people because, I think she said, because who wants to invite, a boring scientist to come on the show and complain about uranium, let's say. Whereas if you have famous people leading the message, it gets more media coverage.
Yeah, it can. No doubt about it. But there's famous people on both sides. Reagan was a famous person. Bob Hope, John Wayne, these guys were famous. Yeah. So there is a battle in the celebrity community.
Yeah.
And creative people, I think, tend to be on the good side of most issues. Yeah. But that cuts both ways. But what really helps us is music. It's very hard to make music a reactionary force. I am going to have to go with my website, nukefree.org, is where people can go to see some stuff, and also Solartopia.org. Right. And my book, Solartopia, is still a bit current. It's a vision of a green-powered Earth. I haven't been to Canada for many years, but I did, you'll be glad to know, in 1972, hitchhike. I was in Montreal. I stayed for a while on a farm south of Montreal, and then I hitchhiked from Montreal to Vancouver. And it was a wonderful experience. It was in 1972. I don't know if you could still do that. Maybe, if you know, what is the Trans-Canada? Is it 17? Is that the number of the highway?
Well, in Toronto area, it's called the 401. I think it turns into different numbers. I think after your Iraq war, we named it Highway of Heroes. We keep renaming it. Yeah. But,
it was a wonderful experience. It was a 2-lane highway at the time.
Yeah.
So that dates me. And I've always loved Canada. And I hope to God that we can get these reactors at Darlington, Bruce, and Pickering shut down. I mean, that's the main agenda. So do me a favor, call me again. Let's talk for another hour sometime.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. We're going to list your books and articles and web pages. And what's your Twitter? Might as well say it.
I think it's just Harvey Wasserman.
Yeah,
it might be Solartopia.
Yeah.
Hashtag Solartopia. And go to my website, solartopia.org, and visit me and have you on again. I'd love to talk to you again.
And your radio show. Can we listen to it on the web, or do we have to be in California?
No, prn.fm it's a webcast. It goes on every Thursday, but it's available. It's a Gary Knowles progressive radio network. prn.fm. My show is the Solartopia Green Power and Wellness Show. I do it every Thursday, but the podcasts are up, and you can get them at any time, anywhere on the web. And I just did you and I just talked about voting machines. I just did a really interesting show with some experts in voting machines. Okay. And you may want to take a listen to that.
Absolutely.
I think you'll find it really interesting.
Thank you so much for your time. Harvey Wasserman is an author and activist for grassroots democracy and election protection. Harvey has served as senior advisor to Greenpeace USA. He marched with Dr. Martin Luther King in Mississippi in 1966 and marched for peace in Vietnam. His website's www.nukefree.org and solartopia.org. Wasserman is a historian and radio host. His show, The Green Power and Wellness Hour, airs Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern on the Progressive Radio Network, prn.fm. Harvey Wasserman spoke to us by phone from Los Angeles.
How do we know you're telling the truth?
Because I have no reason to lie. I'm not getting paid to be here.
And you had sex with him?
Yes.
This is porn star Stormy Daniels' only television interview about her alleged relationship with President Trump. What makes this more than just a tabloid scandal involving sex and threats? Just before the election, Daniels was paid hush money by Mr. Trump's lawyer. And as you'll hear, that may have legal and political implications for the president.
The president watches 60 Minutes. If he's watching tonight, what would you say to him?
He knows I'm telling the truth. He's like, wow, you are special. You remind me of my daughter. He's like, you're smart, beautiful, and a woman to be reckoned with. I like you.
At this point, was he doing The Apprentice?
Yes. And he goes, got an idea, honey bunch.
You were 27, he was 60. Were you physically attracted to him?
No.
Not at all?
No.
Did you want to have sex with him?
No. But I didn't say no. I'm not a victim. I'm not.
It was entirely consensual?
Oh, yes. Yes. I was in a parking lot going to a fitness class with my infant daughter. I was taking, the seats facing backwards in the back seat, diaper bag, getting all the stuff out. And a guy walked up on me and said to me, leave Trump alone, forget the story. And then he leaned around and looked at my daughter and said, it's a beautiful little girl. It'd be a shame if something happened to her mom. And then he was gone.
Find us on Twitter, @thatarcher. Our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Find us on Android and Apple podcast apps. Subscribe and rate the show on iTunes.
I'm Dave Archer.
And I am Harvey Sluggo Wasserman in Valley Village, California.